Hello followers of Neuro Takeaway, welcome back to the channel. This week we are gonna talk about the breaking news of the third meeting of the American Society of Pediatric Neuroradiology that took place on the 9th of January this year virtually. I also want to thank the pharmaceutical company Synton Bagot for the support, and even though there were several very interesting conferences, in this video we are going to talk about the neuroradiological manifestations of COVID infection. I know that at the beginning of this pandemic, the general belief was that this virus doesn't affect significantly children, but now we are seeing more and more alterations on imaging in this population. So we are going to see these patterns and their differential diagnosis. Well, in this conference, Professor Camilla Lindan from UCSF showed the results of a very important study that took place last year. It was a multinational, multi-center, collaborative study performed by a group called PCOPIC that collected the neuroradiological manifestations in children with SARS-CoV-2 infection. I have to say that Latin America contributed with 9 of the 38 cases. They were from Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. So without further ado, let's go to the findings. Well, we found 7 patterns on imaging: ADEM-like in the brain, myelitis, neuritis, splenial lesions, myositis, vasculitic and thrombotic lesions, and finally co-infections. It's important to say that around 50% of cases showed more than one pattern, and the most important mechanism was the parainfectious immune-mediated one that was present in about 75% of cases. The most frequent pattern was ADEM-like in the brain. It represented around 40% of cases. You know it very well. There are several lesions in the juxtacortical white matter of both cerebral hemispheres. They are usually large with very diffuse margins, not much mass effect, hyperintensity on T2 and flare, and sometimes, as you can see in the right case of this slide, they can have a restriction on diffusion. And very frequently there is also compromise of the thalami. Well, you can see here another images of this same pattern. One case with a tumefactive plaque, another one with compromise of the corticospinal tracts, and another one with compromise of the visual pathway. Some cases with enhancement with gadolinium, which is always subtle and mild, and finally lesions in the thalami with restriction on diffusion. It's important to note that from all the studies that were performed in these cases, two patients had antibodies, one against anti-MOG and the other against NMDA receptors. So it's evidently that this virus can trigger an immune response against different epitopes, most of which we don't know yet. Other important pattern was the myelitic one. It represented around 20% of cases, and there were 2 forms, 2 flavors. One was the typical transverse myelitis with longitudinally extended lesions with hyperintensity on T2 and STER in the center of the spinal cord without much mass effect and without contrast enhancement. Fortunately, the second pattern was rare. It occurred in 2 patients because it was very severe with necrotizing myelitis, tumefactive lesions, heterogeneous enhancement, restriction on diffusion, and evolution to atrophy. Another important pattern was this one, the neuritic pattern. You can see here enhancement of the cauda equina, which was relatively expected because of the adult experience in which Guillain-Barré syndrome was very frequently associated with COVID-19 infection. But in this series, we found enhancement of several cranial nerves. You can see here enhancement of the oculomotor nerves, of the facial nerves, and spinal nerves too. And there were three characteristics of this pattern. The enhancement is subtle. Many cases have more than one cranial nerve compromised, and in many cases this pattern was asymptomatic. Another relatively unexpected pattern was myositis. It was found in 36% of cases with multisystemic inflammatory syndrome of childhood, and it was manifested by hyperintensities and enhancement with gadolinium on fat-SAT sequences at the muscles of the back of the neck and paraspinal compartments. So it's important to note that if we find these lesions, we can suggest the possibility of infection by COVID-19. This pattern was more predictable because it had been described in adults. It's the presence of splenial lesions. As you can see in these images, you see hyperintensities at the middle of the splenial of the corpus callosum on FLAIR and T2, with different degrees of extension into the forceps major. The lesions usually restrict on diffusion, and they have two characteristics in this population. They were not associated with seizures, and they were reversible. The mechanism of these hyperintensities is not clear, but most authors think that they are secondary to intramyelinic edema because of excitotoxic injury. Another completely unexpected pattern was the fulminant co-infections. Here you can see the presence of 4 cases with different co-infections, 2 by tuberculosis, 1 by a combination of Streptococcus constellatus and Fusobacterium necrophorum, and the 4th one by varicella zoster virus. All of them died, and in all these cases, the patients were previously completely normal. And sadly, we learned from experience. This was a 6-year-old boy, previously healthy, that was admitted at Garrahan Hospital because of symptoms of COVID-19, nausea, vomiting, fever, and then he developed deterioration of consciousness. As you can see, the images show a striking enhancement of the choroid plexus at the level of the foramina of Slushka and the lateral ventricle. Then he had also some abscesses at the cortical subcortical level. Then he developed hydrocephalus with periventricular necrotizing lesions with multiple microbleeding, restriction on diffusion, and finally he died. We had the opportunity to have a biopsy which showed a typical granuloma. We couldn't perform electron microscopy, so we couldn't find what the other case showed, the presence of the virus, COVID virus, along with the presence of the tuberculous bacteria. The interpretation of these fulminant cases is not clear, but there are 2 theories. One is that the virus, the COVID virus, can favor the crossing of the bacteria through the choroid plexus, and the other mechanism is the possibility that the virus can deteriorate the immune response of the patient. Regarding the vascular complications, they weren't as frequent as you would have suspected because of the experience from adults. Here we found very few cases, mostly associated with fulminant co-infections. Here you can see 3 examples. On the left, a patient with multiple punctate micro lesions, hypointense on SWI, that were reversible, so they were interpreted as microthrombi. In the middle, we have another case with a typical infarction of the midbrain associated with enhancement of the walls of the basilar artery, so it was a case of vasculitis. And the third one was a patient with a typical superior sagittal sinus thrombosis associated with COVID-19 infection. And here you can see the conclusions drawn by Camilla Lindan from this experience. We can say that all in all, the neurological complications of COVID-19, fortunately, are rare, but we can certainly see patients with mild to moderate CNS lesions. The possibility of a fatal fulminant co-infection exists. The presence of multisystemic inflammatory syndrome may be associated with myositis and splenial lesions. Vascular complications are not as frequent as in adults. And finally, the main mechanism of neurological complications in these children is a parainfectious immunomediated mechanism. And fortunately, in general, the outcome was good. So with this, I finish this review, and I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next week. Bye-bye.